All right, so I think we'll get started now. Thank you for anyone who's joining us today. This is the Canada Science and Technology Museum's monthly Google Hangout as part of the Canada Energy Literacy Network. This webinar is held every Thursday, the last Thursday of every month, and it's an opportunity to gather people together whose interests lie in energy and education. As always, we encourage any viewers to ask questions throughout the discussion. To do so, you can mouse over the top, and you should see a Q&A app as a viewer, and type your question in, and we will address that as soon as we're able to. Aussi, je veux mentionner que les présentations aujourd'hui seraient en anglais, mais comme toujours, tout le monde qui voit les présentations peut demander des questions dans la langue de votre choix, et nous, on va essayer de répondre comme on peut. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change and some of the response here in Canada to this global challenge. Of course, climate change has been a topic that's been very discussed a lot quite recently with the COP21 happening in Paris very soon, and the recently announced carbon policy in Alberta. In addition, Alberta is working on developing some new educational curriculum around climate, so they really are leading the way in opening that discussion to students. And some of our partners at ACE, the Alberta Council for Environmental Education, have been really involved in working that new curriculum. But what does all this mean for Canada as a country, as well as for individuals, businesses, and communities? And what role can education on climate and energy play in helping Canada achieve its climate goals? We're going to be exploring this topic more as we move forward into 2016, and we know more about what Canada's commitments are internationally. But I wanted to bring today some different perspectives into find about what their organizations are doing to address climate change. Today we have three speakers. We have Thomas Berry, the British Deputy High Commissioner here in Ottawa. On November 9th, the British High Commission in Ottawa unveiled a photo display highlighting cutting-edge UK innovations and low-carbon technologies as the world prepares for COP21. Tonja Leach, Director of Communication and National Affairs at Poly-Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow, or QUEST. QUEST is a nonprofit organization that conducts research, engagement, and advocacy work to advance smart energy communities in Canada. They define smart energy communities as ones that improve energy efficiency, enhance reliability, cut costs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we also have Geoff Holmes from Carbon Engineering, a company that has a test project in Squamish, BC, that's commercializing technology to help capture carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, and the plan is to then use that captured carbon dioxide to produce ultra-low carbon fuels. So without any delay, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas Berry from the British High Commission and hear about what they're doing. Take it away, Thomas.
Thank you, Jason. Sorry, I was having some problem unmuting, and thank you for the initiative in inviting me to come along to this Google Hangout. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to your audience. And it's precisely the reason that we wanted to have this exhibition in the first place, is to engage a new section of society which is different from the policymakers and the people in government with whom we normally talk. So thank you. What I want to do is firstly explain why did we have an exhibit outside the front of the High Commission in Ottawa. Second, what it shows, and third, just a little bit about what we're hoping to see coming out of the Paris climate talks at the start of December. So why? I've alluded to this already. We have an intense and ongoing conversation with the Canadian government, with lawmakers and the provincial governments around Canada on an ongoing basis about what measures they're taking and we're taking in the UK to combat climate change. But it can be a very narrow discussion, and it's very focused in a kind of esoteric policy atmosphere. But we realise that if climate change is to be addressed, and to be addressed in a way which prevents catastrophic global warming, this is an issue which is going to require behavioural change and awareness across the whole part of society, whether that's because people are going to change the way they do things day to day, and also the way in which they vote and take political decisions and are active in informing their lawmakers and the conversations which happen around the dinner table. So what we decided to do was to have an exhibit, and rather than talk about how we might construct a carbon market, which I think is quite difficult to show visually, Instead, we wanted to talk about what the UK has been doing to combat climate change. And this is not just about policy. It's also thinking about what the low-carbon future looks like. What are the energies and the technologies which we are going to need over the course of the next 20 and 30 years if we're going to deliver a world which which has low-carbon energy? So there are 6 pictures we've chosen. We've chosen to be both visually striking, but also to illustrate a story about the low-carbon economy. One is a wind farm, an iconic picture of a wind farm in Wales, which demonstrates how we can get alternative sources of energy. A second one is a tidal energy turbine in Scotland, which is something which we in the UK are very proud of. We have very choppy seas around the UK. We have lots of seas, and having a tidal energy turbine is a great way of using that energy, that unfocused energy, in a focused way to deliver lights and heating for homes. We also have, a bit more excitingly, a race car, which is the fastest zero-emissions race car, electric car, and that was developed within the UK. Perhaps more mundanely, but also very importantly, a smart, innovative building which is built out of new materials, which generate a lower carbon footprint and results in less waste. That's particularly an issue for the UK, where we have an aging housing stock. So how do we get a low energy environment and generate smart cities? We have a balloon. And the balloon is actually being set off by a researcher from the UK's Meteorological Office, because the UK has played a leading role in monitoring climate, monitoring weather, monitoring the changes which are happening to our world. And we found that in order for us to generate the evidence and understand what's happening in the world and take actions, both to mitigate against climate change, but also to adapt to it, that's critically important. Let me just finish by just talking about what we're going to do, looking ahead towards the Paris meeting. Where we are right now is that national commitments fall significantly short of a pathway of a 2-degree pathway, which is what the experts reckon is the maximum which the world could adapt to without causing significant dislocation. We're about 3 degrees at the moment, so there's quite a long way to go. So we need a deal now. It has to happen, and a strong deal is the most desirable, and that will help us avoid the risk of dangerous climate change. And not only is a deal necessary, but it's also would be a massively important symbolic step forward. We've seen repeated iterations of failed climate talks around the world, and if businesses and people are to take the global system of addressing climate change seriously, then we need to have a deal, and it sends an important symbol that we are serious about addressing this global threat. The UK, as well as the actions which we're taking nationally for reducing our carbon emissions, has also been committed to providing finance to particularly developing countries which need to take actions themselves. So we've been at the forefront of helping with that. And it's not just about the international negotiation, but also we think an economic story. So as the innovations which I've highlighted, I hope highlight, the progress towards a new low-carbon economy is not something which is damaging to the economic environment, but rather something which will help enhance it. And you see that these low-carbon products are growing incredibly rapidly, and we think a source of future economic growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to save them for later, and I'm going to move on to Tonja. So Tonja, I'll hand it over to you, and you can tell us a little bit more about Quest.
Let me unmute myself. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting us to come and join today as well. We have a bit of a unique approach. Quest, as Jason mentioned, is focused on advancing smart energy communities in Canada, and we, through our research, have shown that communities have a huge role to play in addressing climate change and energy use. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a very short video, assuming it works, to just give you a sense of what smart energy communities are all about, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing. So let me try and share my screen. And I'll just wait for Jason to give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. And now I'm going to start this video for us.
Canada is made up of over 5,000 communities. These communities account for 61% of energy use and more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Herein lies an opportunity. Let's make our communities into smart energy communities. In so doing, improve energy efficiency, cut costs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what does a smart energy community look like? First, conventional energy networks get integrated. That means that the electricity, natural gas, district energy, and transportation fuel networks in a community are better coordinated to match energy needs with the most efficient energy source. When conventional energy networks are integrated, it opens the door to innovations like alternative fuel vehicles, energy storage, waste heat capture, and combined heat and power. Second, a smart energy community considers land use, recognizing that poor land use decisions can equal a whole lot of energy waste. Third, a smart energy community harnesses local energy opportunities. These can be stock opportunities like solar, wind, and geothermal, or they can be opportunities that are tailored to a community, like water source cooling, sewage heat capture, biomass for heating, and capturing biogases for electricity and transportation fuel. Every community will have its own unique mix of local energy opportunities. Together, they can achieve significant energy efficiency improvements. Integrating conventional energy networks, making smart land use decisions, harnessing local energy opportunities. West, advancing smart energy communities in Canada.
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Can you see me, Jason? Yes, great. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so now you know a little bit more about what smart energy communities are. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this has to do with COP21 and what this has to do with climate change in general. If COP21 is successful in achieving the outcomes they're looking for, it means now more than ever it's time to actually get serious about how we achieve our targets, whether they be federal, provincial, regional, municipal, and beyond our own borders. But there's an important distinction between setting targets and delivering on them. It'd be nice to have a silver bullet solution that would get us there, but that just isn't the case. It's going to take all hands on deck. Solutions being implemented in big energy supply, transmission, energy end use in our homes and buildings, transportations, water and waste streams, and many other areas. One of the biggest challenges we face here in Canada will be shifting our focus from big energy or the supply conversation to small energy, the demand side, or how we are using our energy. Because what is really going to matter in a carbon-constrained world is energy. It's not energy consumption. It's energy production. It's not production. It's consumption. And what this really means is a whole lot of energy efficiency. After all, it's impossible to deny that the cheapest and most environmentally sustainable form of energy is the unit that we don't use. And while we need all hands on deck coming up with and implementing solutions, whether they be on the supply side or the use side, if we look at the numbers, our communities are going to play a huge role in meeting those targets. Currently in Canada, communities account for 60% of energy use and 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Much of those community emissions come from transportation and buildings. And as luck would have it, in both of those sectors, the remaining energy potential is huge. So we have a huge opportunity that we can actually cut energy use and reduce the emissions in both of those sectors. We're also lucky that while the energy discussion in Canada has been increasingly centered on supply over the past few decades, our communities have actually started to think about energy and what their role is in the sector. Communities have been driven by a need and desire to reduce their operational costs. So they are, in a sense, increasingly well positioned for the carbon-constrained future that is quickly coming our way. Currently, 180 communities in Canada have a community energy plan, and those communities represent over 50% of the Canadian population. In addition, Quest, through a multi-stakeholder initiative, has identified over 640 policies in Canada that support community energy planning. So it sounds like all the stars are aligning. Of course, communities too have their challenges in reducing their consumption and emissions. They're facing regulatory barriers, public confidence challenges, which obviously moves into political challenges, funding gaps, communication challenges, and a need for an unprecedented amount of collaboration and partnerships. It's very complicated, but if COP21 is successful, it should serve to create an environment that is more receptive to the changes that we need, and one which offers more opportunity to overcome some of the challenges we are facing. I just want to dive into a little bit about sort of education and what's the role of education that we see in helping Canada achieve its climate goals. There's a couple of factors at play, and that education is sort of directly in line to help serve. First is energy literacy. The majority of Canadians don't connect oil sands with how they drive their car or flicking on a light switch with coal-fired generation. The other challenge here is that many Canadians don't have much appetite to learn more about energy. So education has a huge role to play in coming up with creative ways to increase Canada's energy literacy. I'll give you an example. I learned this week actually about a town in Perth Andover, called Perth Andover in New Brunswick. And they needed to reduce their energy costs. So they investigated some community energy efficiency options. But in implementing them, they discovered that the savings to the community were significant. But in order to make it tangible and real for the constituent base, they decided that some of the savings should be used to give back to the community. So they implemented a free swimming and skating program. The indirect effect has been that now the entire community is looking for additional energy efficiency opportunities to save money so that they can offset their programs and services in the community. It's a win-win, and the community has indirectly increased the energy efficiency of the community. Sorry, the energy literacy of the community. Another factor or place where I think education has a huge role is in partnerships and collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, many of the solutions that we need to implement are complex and require multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration. There's an absolute need for continued efforts of organizations like Let's Talk Energy, the Energy Exchange, Carbon Talks, and others to generate general awareness, as well as more targeted and refined engagement strategies for decision makers like municipalities, building owners and operators, and utilities. There's a big part of community energy plan is developing multi-stakeholder partnerships, not only to deliver the actions identified in the plan, but the development of the plan in the first place. Without the buy-in of all stakeholders, whether they be government, utilities, or builders and developers and others, the plan will never get off the ground. Some governments are facilitating or indirectly encouraging these partnerships, such as in Ontario, with their regional electricity plans and the establishment of local advisory groups that are addressing the role of local in meeting energy and climate goals. Utilities are starting to consider how to shift themselves from a fuel source delivery agent to an energy service provider. And builders and developers are starting to recognize that there's a lot of money to be made delivering a home or a building that has significantly lower operating costs rather than granite countertops. In summary, I think it's a very exciting time for all of us. The next decade is going to be messy as we try to sort out how we all have to evolve to address climate change. The important thing is that we don't wait for a perfect solution. We move forward with the solutions we have today, no matter how imperfect they may be, and that we get everyone doing their part. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tonja. Also, lots of thoughts that are being sparked by some of the things you said, but we'll wait for some questions to come from that, and we'll turn it over to Geoff Holmes now from Carbon Engineering. So, Geoff, tell us more about the project that your company was working on.
Great, thank you for the intro, Jason, and just a quick mic check before I launch into it. If you can't hear me very well, please. Okay, looks like you can. So thanks for having us on the webinar today, Jason, and really interesting to sort of see the comments from the other two speakers as well. Just one note, I'm kind of suffering from a cold and under the weather today, so my voice isn't at its most loud or eloquent, so please bear with me, and I hope you can understand okay. Anyways, I'm here representing the company that I work for called Carbon Engineering. And we're a homegrown Canadian clean tech company. We were founded in Calgary in 2009. And our sole mission since that time has been to develop and commercialize technology that can enable the extraction of industrial scale quantities of CO2 from atmospheric air. So we all know that there's lots of people working on the challenge of capturing CO2 from flue gas, and we think that's really important, along with all of the energy efficiency and community design measures and every other option that's already on the table. But we see a lot of value in pursuing this approach of capturing CO2 directly from ambient air as well, and there's a few reasons for that. So first off, just to kind of state the obvious, it's a harder challenge than separating CO2 from flue gas. When you go to a power plant or an industrial facility and look at the smokestack, by volume of what's coming out of that smokestack, something like 10% is going to be CO2, and the rest will be nitrogen and water vapor and other trace gases. The atmosphere itself is only 0.04% CO2. And that's problematic because it used to be 0.03%. That's what the whole climate change fuss is about. But 0.04% is still very dilute. So that means that we have to process a lot of atmospheric CO2 to get a given quantity a lot of atmospheric air to get a given quantity of CO2. And it also means that there's a thermodynamic energy penalty, for the real sort of engineering nerds on the webinar today. That requires more energy to separate that CO2 out and get it into pure form. So there's a couple challenges, but if you roll up your sleeves and start looking at the engineering, it's not long before you realize that there's really no barriers to doing this at large scale, and that really the important question is at what cost can we capture CO2 from the air? This is it's a technical approach that's used in spaceships and submarines and has been for decades, so nobody doubts that it can be done or that it'll work. People just don't know how much equipment it's going to take and how much energy and what it's going to cost. So those are the issues that we work on. Now, why might we want to do this? Well, first things first, only about 40% of our emissions economy-wide or even globally come out of flue stacks. So there's an awful lot of emissions globally that come out of what we would call distributed and mobile sources. So these are everything from airplanes and long-haul trucks and ships and even land use change when a farmer in some part of the world cuts down some forests to graze cattle or to plant crops. There's all sorts of distributed emissions out there that have varying degrees of amenability to capture or prevention at source. And there's many that there are clever and innovative fixes for at source, and there's others that basically all of us in the sort of climate and energy field really scratch our heads over and say, gosh, how are we gonna stop that? So that's why we think this notion of capturing CO2 back from the air has an interesting potential role to play if we can make it work and if we can make the economics happen. So just take an example of cars for an illustrative purpose. Our engineering spec for a direct air capture plant, we commonly talk about a plant at about 1 million tons per year CO2 scale as our engineering spec, and that's what we'd like to build at very large commercial scale. And at that size, that corresponds to the amount of emissions that come out of 250,000 cars over the course of a year. So when we start thinking about air capture, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's cheaper or what's more efficient or what's going to get us down the emissions curve quicker? Is it replacing the 250,000 cars on the road with new vehicles that don't emit CO2, like electrics or very efficient hybrids or fuel cell vehicles fueled off renewable hydrogen? Or can we more efficiently capture their emissions post facto with an air capture system? And that answer doesn't fall on one side or the other 100% of the time. There are different cases where the right answer is to control the emissions at source, and there are other cases where if we can really make air capture work, it's a pretty interesting answer. So that's the sort of large-scale motivation, and then the questions really become, how do you get this into the marketplace, and how do you start using this technology if you can develop it to a point of readiness? And we see a lot of excitement actually in playing in the transportation sector in the coming years. A really interesting thing that you can do with air capture that goes above and beyond capturing emissions and storing them to compensate for tailpipe or control at source. Another really interesting thing you can do with air capture is if you have scrubbed CO2 from the air and you've got that in a purified format, then what you can do is actually use renewable electricity to bond it with hydrogen and make octane or diesel molecules. So you could make octane or diesel, and those fuels would be manufactured from CO2 that came from the air and would be manufactured from carbon-free electricity like solar or hydro or wind. And then when those fuels are burned, they actually just return the fuel, they return the CO2 back to the air from where it came. So it's a potential route to closed carbon cycle fuels. And this is sort of a different way of doing what many people have tried to do with biofuels. And it's basically just a mechanized way of doing the same thing that uses a heck of a lot less land and a heck of a lot less water. And by no means would we claim that it's a fix-all approach, but we would claim that it's an interesting concept, and we should be evaluating along with many of our other options. So just getting back to the question that Jason originally asked, what's happening in Squamish? Well, for the first time in our trajectory, and for the first time ever, we're running a 1 ton per day air capture plant in Squamish. So this is the first full end-to-end demonstration of our technology, and we're capturing about a ton a day of CO2 out of the air as we speak, and we're using a bunch of equipment out there that is what we call industrially representative. It's equipment that's actually scaled down from large-scale designs, so that if it all works in Squamish, we know that it's going to work in at larger commercial scale. So for us, this is both a very hard time as a company, getting that first plant off the ground, and it's also a very exciting time in terms of seeing how our designs that we've only tested at lab scale or in prototype scale before, or have seen work on paper, now we get to see how they work in the real world. So this is kind of the pleasure of being a technology proponent and an innovator. I think I'll end there.
Great, thank you very much, Geoff. There was actually a question that came up, and I'm going to actually direct this first one. There's some others that came in earlier. I'll address those in a moment, but there's one that's very specific to your presentation. And it asks, could there be any unintended consequences from capturing carbon from atmospheric air?
Yeah, let me take a swat at that. I wouldn't say. I mean, maybe the viewer is kind of, or the person who asked the question is kind of alluding to the fact, if we captured all of the CO2 in the air, then plants couldn't live, and we've got a bit of a Dr. Evil scenario there where we hold the planet hostage. But I can assure you that's not going to happen anytime soon. We build plants that we think will, or we're aiming to build plants that we think will capture about 1 million tons of CO2 per year. And without even going into how that ranks alongside the Earth's natural carbon cycles and carbon fluxes between forests and the atmosphere and the ocean and atmosphere, that is 1/30,000th of how much CO2 that people are emitting to the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. So we would have to build 30,000 plants to capture all of humanity's emissions. So it's not an approach that it's not an approach that we advocate. We think it's a tool that has its place alongside many of the other options, but much like Tonja said, we need every option that we have at our fingertips to make a dent at the climate problem. In terms of other unintended consequences, if the person wants to re-ask and maybe allude even more to what those specifically would be, I'd be happy to answer again. But no, it's an industrial technology that looks a lot like a factory or a pulp mill. It has to be run with proper environmental health and safety standards, like we run all the other industries in our country. But it would look pretty familiar from sort of an equipment and facility perspective.
Great, thanks, Geoff. There was a question also, and I'll get to the others, like I said. But how do you store the carbon once it's captured? And also, Tonja, you might know about if any communities you work with are doing any carbon storage. or Thomas, if anything's happening in the UK on that front.
Sure, I'll take a real quick swat at it, and then I'll let the others chime in as well. So we don't work on the storage side. We only work on capture and purification. And then the way any hypothetical business model or hypothetical project would work is we would pass the CO2 off in pure format to someone else who does CO2 injection. And if you're talking about a sequestration case, injection underground is kind of the gold standard. It's what people do to the tune of 80 million tons per year down in Texas and Oklahoma, and have been doing since the 70s. The only catch is they're doing it to produce oil instead of store the CO2. So it's a relatively standardized industrial technology, and I know there's been some fright about CO2 storage and risks and so on, but there is actually a lot of industrial precedent that you can do it safely. That whole question goes away if we talk about using the CO2 to then make gasoline or diesel molecules. There's no storage required. You're just putting carbon neutral fuels into the market that can displace those from oil. So I'll end there.
I don't know if anybody, Tonja or Thomas, if either of you know of any projects that are happening in your fields. Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
So astute listeners would have noticed I only talked about five projects on the front of the High Commission and not the sixth. The sixth is actually the one I forgot, but let me talk about it now, which is precisely that, which is a carbon capture and storage project which Shell and the Alberta government and the UK are helping to run out in Alberta. And that is a test project which is about taking some emissions from oil sands operations and storing those underground. So the UK government believes that carbon capture and storage is an important part of the trajectory to decarbonising the global energy, and that's and it's quite exciting to be working in Canada, in Alberta, on a project which will at least test what's an emerging technology.
Great.
I think if I can just add, Jason, I don't have anything from any projects that I'm aware of at a community level that are addressing sort of a carbon capture. Most of that happens sort of in industrial processes, has been talked about already. So nothing that I'm aware of on the community front.
Great. Just also to chime in with a little bit of what I know, once you store the carbon underground, it actually goes through a chemical process, and it depends on the type of rock formation that it's stored into, but that carbon actually converts into minerals and actually becomes stone, a carbonate stone itself. Now that process takes some time, but that's sort of a long-term view, is that when it goes underground, it isn't just sitting there as a whole bunch of compressed air, but it actually reforms into minerals. There's a couple of other questions. A couple of people were asking about whether the museum's program would be going to Paris to participate in the upcoming talks. I wish I could say that I was going, although we aren't actually right now. There's been a change of government, so that's affected as a national museum. We work with the Minister of Heritage, so we've just begun some conversations with the new minister there. We will hopefully be talking to the new Minister of Climate, or of Environment and Climate Change soon, but she's quite busy right now in her preparations, so we haven't had a chance to have those conversations. We have had some invites. There is a group called Student Energy who is going. They are actually based out of Alberta, and I just heard from them. They will be having a side event in Paris, and they really focus on that university and college market. So somebody was asking about would we be going there with any youth delegation. We aren't, but there are definitely some Canadian contingents that focus on youth that will be there. And if anyone who's participating has any questions, I encourage you to email me, and we can have a conversation about that offline. So I can be reached at Armstrong Jason at techno-science.ca. So I'll list that again at the end of the conversation. Okay, somebody who is having some problems with the broadcast, they can, if you try leaving it and coming back in, it might reactivate your visuals. Are there any other questions out there? I'm just going to go through some of them here and get rid of them from the list. Actually, I had a question for you, Thomas, about a project you mentioned that you have up, the tidal turbines. Here on the museum's front lawn, we also have a tidal turbine that had some testing done on both the east and west coast. How close are the projects in Scotland to going online?
I think that most of them are in the testing phase at the moment. So they are, yes, so they're in the testing phase at the moment. Which the very difficult thing with these tidal turbines is that they're existing in these difficult marine environments, and so the challenge of getting scalable power is a significant engineering challenge. The seas around Scotland are a particularly challenging place to be, and there are a number of off-site tests. I think that in Canada, the Fundy is probably the major one which I'm aware of, and we're also talking to some of the people out in BC about how they're doing it, because there's a number of players operating in tidal turbines.
It seems like an amazingly huge potential for harnessing energy that's there, like you said, in this disorganized fashion and organizing.
It's getting the scale is the difficult thing.
Yeah, and just like you mentioned, the harsh environment. We have a question here, and so I'll put it to each of you because I think you might all have different answers. If you could all have one policy measure that comes out of Paris, what would be ideal for you and your mission for the organization you're working with? So I'm not sure who wants to start that out, but one policy measure that could come out of Paris. Who wants to keep that off?
Sure, I'll take a swing, Jason. Oh, Tony, do you want to go ahead?
You're up, Geoff.
Okay. Well, obviously in Paris, so much of it is about these, these determined commitments from each country, and every country sort of, deciding what they're going to put on the auction block to get all the other countries in, to ante up as well. And it's always so interesting. It's like watching the highest stakes poker game you've ever seen in your life. Where no one country or no one actor wants to move alone because, they incur all the challenge and yet reap no benefit if nobody else antes up. So it's just fascinating from sort of a human and a sort of game theory kind of perspective. But yeah, personally, I actually think we're headed for a pretty friendly outcome in terms of locking countries into some binding commitments. I think all the chatter that I've been hearing, and I'm not necessarily more plugged in than anybody else, but I watch the news a lot, and from the chatter that I'm seeing, we're headed towards targets that would result in a 2.7 degree warming, and obviously that's not good enough, but it's better than no targets at all. So I think as a first step, putting that in the bag and agreeing to it, and then moving on with the notion that we can turn the dial later, I think is actually a very smart move from the French organizers that have been working behind the scenes for months now. So yeah, personally, I want to see people sign up and agree on binding commitments. I think we can decide where to set the dial later in time, and then where it gets really interesting is one tier down from Paris, when the countries come home and decide how they're going to implement, what kind of policies they're going to implement to achieve those targets. So it's one thing to say we're going to make big cuts. It's another thing to have a plan, both from a policy and a technical perspective to actually do it. So that's where things get really interesting as well. And I mean, all of us on the, all of us speakers, and probably a lot of the folks in the you know, listening in have probably all heard 100 times about a carbon tax, but I'll just throw my voice behind that as well. The legal certainty of an escalating carbon tax to triple digits in another few decades, it would do absolute wonders in terms of driving investment decisions from, you know, fossil-intensive energy projects to low-carbon energy sources, causing companies and institutions and even individual actors to really think a lot harder about how much energy they're using and what forms it's coming in. And you know, Tonja said there's no silver bullet, and I do agree, but if there's anything kind of close to a silver bullet, it's a really simple and sort of bulletproof carbon tax, and I would just kind of put my name underneath that. So I'm curious to hear what the other speakers think as well.
Oh, you beat me to it, Thomas. Off you go.
Okay, so as a policy wonk, I'm intrinsically uncomfortable with one policy because I want to say it's complicated, but we all know that. So I think instead I'd say the long-term goal and the commitment to that long-term goal. So you know, drawing a point out towards the end of the century and saying we need to be there by the end of the century is and a commitment, a credible commitment from the international community is the single most important thing which will come out of Paris. And then if I'm going to add a second one, which would be not looking at that goal and then keep looking at that goal as we go forward. So looking at this again and again over the course of the next, every 5 years, saying, are we getting there? Why are we not getting there? If we are getting there, and kind of constantly looking towards that target and error correcting ourselves into knowing where we need to get to, but knowing where we need to get to and everyone agreeing that it will be an amazing first step which should come out of Paris.
I think I agree with both. Can you hear me, Jason? Yeah. I both of the comments of the other panelists. I think, you know, that again, not one policy. I think there's a whole suite of policies that we need that sort of serve all sectors of the economy. So, but I think what really matters is, yeah, some binding agreements, and we need that target that's sort of way out there in the distance, but we also need the pathway to that target. It's you know, we've set targets in previous years where we said, you know, by 2050 we will be in such and such a place, but that doesn't communicate urgency. And right now we're in a position that we can set a target out to the end of the century, but if we don't set the pathway to get ourselves there, then we'll just keep spinning our wheels like we have been doing for the past 5-10 years, however long, and not actually start to get on that train, that transition train, as I seem to be calling it these days, to get ourselves moving forward on, you know, in the direction that we need to go. So, so again, I don't. You know, if it's good to have, we need those targets. What that actual number is and how many degrees that is somewhat irrelevant at this point. We need to be establishing a long-term goal and a pathway to get there, and then really the rubber hits the road when we get back to Canada, and you know, what's happening at all levels of government, what's happening federally, what's happening at the provincial government level, and then even at the municipal government level. We often forget about the municipal governments and the role that they play, and they have a huge role to play, and we don't want to forget them.
One of the things I find really interesting is there seems to be a bit more of a sense of optimism around this talk, and I think that's on a whole bunch of different levels from a lot of different countries. And I know that it's been, you know, as somebody alluded to before, like a series of failed, you know, meetings that have been happening over the years. And I don't know if it's just the acknowledgement that, you know, this is serious and we need to really begin looking at it, or if it's also some of the technologies that are beginning to mature that there seems to be some more solutions that are there. But it's really interesting to see the level of, you know, cautious optimism, I would say, around this debate right now. So it's really encouraging, having done work with energy education for the last number of years here at the Museum of Science and Tech. It has been an evolving conversation, and one that was sort of hopeless, I would say, at one point a number of years ago, to one that's becoming a little more, as you mentioned, Tonja, it's going to be messy. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's very uncertain how that's going to happen. But the fact that it feels like that there is actually a lot of progress that is just around the corner.
Mhm.
I'm kind of highlighting one of the comments here from Christina. Climate change education coming in Alberta from Premier Notley just yesterday. That's really interesting because a lot of these changes do happen generationally, and we know that climate change is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. But getting kids involved in this discussion is really important. One of the examples that was used in another conversation was that whole recycling thing that all of us do naturally now without even thinking. We sort our garbage in 5 different ways, and nobody blinks an eye. But when that first was being proposed back in the late 80s and early 90s, maybe we can get this going in some schools. Kids will do it, but it'll never catch on at home. And I know that it's a much smaller scale problem than something like climate change. But you get kids involved. You get them thinking about those things. They bring those lessons home. They grow up having done those things, and it just becomes second nature. You have this whole generational change. So, seeing that some climate change policy coming out of Alberta yesterday is also really exciting. Thomas, there's a question here from another viewer who wanted to know. It says, you mentioned developing countries need to take action too. They were wondering in what way the UK is working with developing countries to reduce their emissions. Sure.
So I think there are several aspects to this question, and the most important of them is the money. It's expensive to both adapt to climate change, and we know that the costs of climate change will fall disproportionately on the poorest countries, and also for them to, as they develop their economies and seek to grow, that they are able to do so in a way which doesn't compound the problem which was created by us developed folks back in the day. So how do you square that circle? And I think mobilizing public and private money is the first step towards that. And there is a commitment to raising, I think, $100 billion worth of climate financing from Paris, and the UK has committed to at least 5.8 billion pounds, so it's about $10 billion towards that goal. So I think that's the most important thing, is providing that climate finance to allow developing countries to develop in a sustainable way. But on top of that, the technology it has the virtue of only needing to be developed once, and once as we see the price of things like solar panels and other low carbon technologies falling so dramatically over the course of the last few years, then the export of those technologies from the UK, from Canada, to the developing world will enable them to make that transition straight to a low carbon economy without passing go.
In a very similar way to how you see in a lot of these developing just their telecommunication systems, right there, they skip over the cell phone.
That's right, and the same would apply with mobile banking as well. So you see that in a number of different occasions, you can just get there straight away without needing to pass through the intermediate phases.
All right, I don't see any more questions right now. Is there any questions either any of you would like to ask each other, or? I do have one for you, Geoff. The process of running this industrial scale capture, how much energy does it take to remove the carbon from the atmosphere? You did talk briefly about a thermodynamic challenge there, but how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, really the question you're getting at, Jason, is what's the net carbon balance, right? And of course, it's foolish. It's really foolish to remove a ton of CO2 from the air if you had to use sufficient energy that a ton goes out the flue stack of a coal plant that's powering your system, right? You've achieved nothing. You've just given some people jobs. So the question of net carbon balance is a really interesting one, and there's kind of a complicated answer because it depends on deployment. So if we were going to tailor this technology to inject CO2 underground to store it, then ironically we would actually use natural gas to power the system. because what we're able to do is use that natural gas to power the entire plant in such a way that the CO2 produced from its combustion and use to deliver the energy needed for the plant ends up in the very same stream as the atmospheric CO2, and both go down the wellbore together. So you don't actually end up re-emitting from your energy use and negating the CO2 that you capture from the air. If we're talking about capturing CO2 to make fuels, then the onus is to really reduce that natural gas stream as much as possible. Even starting with it, even if you use natural gas to power the air capture system and you used renewable electricity to do the rest of the fuel synthesis, you'd already be making fuels that are far, far lower life cycle carbon intensity than conventional. So it'd be a big step forward. But technically, I do think we can do better, and I think we can, almost or entirely eliminate that natural gas stream so that the entire air capture and fuel synthesis facility is powered by renewable electricity, and then you don't have any fossil emissions or fossil energy involved in the process at all. So it's fully carbon neutral except for the emissions to actually construct the plant in the first place.
Interesting. All right. So I guess any final words then? If not, we can wrap this up.
No final words other than to say this is we're in exciting times, and I think that it's wonderful to see various technologies, various governments, all of our governments starting to come together. First time that our premiers have met with our prime minister in, was it 7 years altogether? So I think there's some really positive changes afoot, and exciting times ahead of us. I think we're going to see some exponential growth, I hope, in how we address climate change in the next few years.
I agree. I'd like to do a follow-up session. We won't be doing another hangout for the viewers who are on now, or anyone tuning in to this later on. We won't be doing one in December, as it'll fall between the Christmas and New Year, the last Thursday of the month. So we will resume these in January. We'll be doing one during February for our Talk Energy Week, but by March or April, as people were alluding to, the devil will be in the details. Canada will have made some commitments in Paris, I expect, and we'll be all kind of struggling with what that means and how we actually meet those goals. So I'd like to revisit this question with some presenters again in the spring and see where we are and what's moved and what that reality is now for us. So
yeah, and just for whoever's listening, I'll end on a quick note as well. I mean, first of all, thanks for convening this, and cool to hear the other comments, and I hope the people who tuned in learned something interesting today. And like Tonja, I would just kind of end on a point of optimism. I mean, from a technical standpoint, a prosperous carbon neutral future is absolutely possible. The challenge is finding the policies and the business models and the geopolitical agreements to get us there. And I really do believe in sort of a bright future where we've tackled emissions, and I'd like to end on that note.
Thanks, Geoff.
I also just say I'm also more optimistic now than I have been for a long time, and I look forward to if we do this again in the spring and talking about where we might go next.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for participating. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in live and who will be watching later on when you have a chance. And we look forward to talking again in the new year in 2016. And we'll be all watching, I'm sure, what's going to be happening in the coming weeks in Paris. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jason.